Good evening, everyone. It's good to have you join us. My name is Emilie Towns. I'm Dean of Vanderbilt Divinity School, and tonight I am joined with three of my colleagues whom I call not only colleagues, but friend and sister. The Reverend Dr. Stacy Floyd Thomas, the Reverend Dr. Lisa Thompson, and the Most Reverend Dr. Phillis Sheppard joins me tonight to talk about womanist work and what we are up to. So let me set the context for us. August 1619, a ship we believe called the White Lion landed in a port near Point Comfort, Virginia, carrying 20 to 30 captive Africans to be sold into slavery. June 17, 2015, 9 members of Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, Mother Emanuel, were massacred by a young white man as they concluded their Bible study because he thought it would start a race war. March 2 through 3, 2020, a tornado outbreak hit Nashville, north and east, destroying buildings and laying open the vulnerability of the North Nashville in its fight against gentrification, housing, healthcare, poverty, public education, and more. March 10, 2020, Vanderbilt and Nashville began their shelter-at-home policies as we consciously entered into a deadly pandemic. How has this pandemic reshaped or reframed our work, my work? Well, it has reminded me that my work sits in a historical framework of various kinds of pandemics, where it is almost certain that darker skinned people will be the hardest hit. It has affected my work by increasing the urgency I feel in how education and theological education must speak to the issues of our day and be clear about being anti-racist and learning how to bring to bear religious claims with a deep sense of justice making unapologetically. So we sit tonight on the eve of the 5th anniversary of Mother Emanuel's massacre. We have no brush harbors, no safe havens. We have our will to live, our will to pray, our will to support one another, our will to plot justice, to live our lives, despite the fact that we were never meant to survive in this land. So we live and work with others to build the hard edges of truth and hope, to live our lives despite the fact that we will no longer play nice and be ladies. I welcome you tonight to 4 women who are not afraid to speak the truth as they know it, see it, feel it, believe it, and more importantly, live it. We begin tonight with Phillis Sheppard.
Thank you, Dean Towns. Let me begin with this. Womanist pastoral care is not lived in a chair, behind a protective desk, or in note-taking or averted eyes. That was my training. Womanist care is active. Activism sees horror, sees terror, and murder. It grieves, fights, shouts, and cries. Womanist pastoral care asks, what kinds of rituals of mourning, lamentation, and grief need to accompany, maybe even evoke, our activism and our scholarship? Womanist care calls us to publicly take note of the highly publicized events of regular, cyclical, death-dealing ways of evil masquerading as for the safety of the people. Womanist care laments when families, children, grief and mourning is stolen, and mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, all of us cannot lovingly cradle our publicly stolen children whose body are displayed in the streets. The loving, tender care of transition from life to death is denied. We dream of water rights, washing of bodies by loved ones, holy water, blessed oil lavishly, lovingly applied. Womanist pastoral care screams, knows trauma, joins in healing spaces. Sometimes we have to leave our training behind because we are listening to the voices on the street, on the front lines, with fists raised, sometimes determined, but also hurting. In the June 5th Womanist, the Washington Post noted this: pandemics are often thought to be unforeseeable acts of God that emerge suddenly to wreak havoc on unsuspecting populations. But that's not how public health practitioners think about them. More often than not, pandemics have a political economy behind them. We know this, in which substandard living and working conditions connected to social inequalities produce opportunities for disease to spread unchecked. The killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, and Tony McDade, to name some, makes us ask, how do we counteract the violence of non-caring policing? This is a healthcare crisis for Black and brown people. The Washington Post. Those social and political contexts also help explain another pandemic. One that, like the coronavirus that still rages, is also killing Black Americans disproportionately. Make no mistake, police violence is a public health problem. The racial disparity in police violence is nearly as stark. In Minneapolis, where George Floyd was horrifically killed by law enforcement, police officers use force against Blacks 7 times more often than against whites. Studies show that Black men in America are likely to die at the hands of a police officer 3.5 times more than someone white. 1 in every 1,000 Black men will die at the hands of police. Compare that to the video circulating on Facebook and social media of the 50-something-year-old white woman who was pulled over by the police. Her plates had expired. When he tried to give her the ticket, she cussed the police officer out. He told her to get out of the car. She said no. He reached for the door and she pulled off. He followed her, reached her, took out his taser, tased her, and she cussed him out again. And then he explained to her, see, you didn't do what I told you to do, so I had to tase you. And she said, I'm still mad. What is the point of this story? She hit the police officer. She ran away from the police officer. She cussed the police officer out. And at the end of the day, she is still breathing. For those of us who do pastoral care, for those of us who teach social justice, the persistence of injustice must not be an opportunity to lapse into cynicism or despair that will paralyze us in our vision and our teaching. It will render us hopeless, turn our activism into caricatures of the past, and our classrooms into rote recitations announcing the advent of death. No, instead, in facing the hegemonic imagination, the historical ethos, and colonized minds in the cultural, caring, activist, loving pedagogical spaces where we are, we must be, act, know, teach as if our lives depended on it. Womanist caring spaces are for flourishing. Our work is essential work. As a Black lesbian womanist, pastoral theologian, I understand counseling, caring, protesting, teaching as potential spaces for the incarnation of love, justice, and community. I perceive my vocation as a collective movement toward a future not yet seen, one we must demand, one for which we must fight. One more just, more loving, one where we know together we will make the difference. So I am more committed to the struggle to use my anger for justice, to love even though hatred finds new ways for old ways of being. I am angry, though I am not bitter, just very clear. How am I? I am listening to the wise ancestors, the steady elders, and the hurrying young, because they all have words, prayers, libations, incantations, divinations, and holy chants I need to hear. So I ask these questions. I ask them all the time. What is happening? Why is it happening? How is it happening? To whom is it happening? And what is being demanded of me? And I ask me, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? With whom and for him? For whom? Womanist pastoral care is activist care. Thank you.
Reverend Dr. Stacy Floyd Thomas.
Good evening. Amidst all of the talk, all of the trauma, all of the tribulation about the present moment in which we find ourselves at the crossroad of pandemics and pandemonium, people are asking, people who've never believed in anything before and people who've believed all of their lives, is this the end time? It's not. This is our time. As Womanists, we believe that the present time in which we find ourselves is a time in which we find women rising to the occasion, being recognized as mayors, as police chiefs, as head of Black Lives Matter movements, women who realize all along that we are the ones the world has been waiting on. And we no longer are waiting in line behind those who are oppressing us to take care of business. Why? I echo the words of Katie Jeannie Buchanan, my muse and my mentor, who said, the work that we do as Womanists is doing the work our souls must have. And doing the work our souls must have harkens to when Alice Walker says, because the work that we do and the lives that we save may very well be our own. And that is the heart of Womanism. Not only as an academic method or theoretical orientation, but it is the meaning of ministries and it's the meaning of movements. When I was introduced to Womanism over 30 years ago, Womanism took my mind where my soul had always been. Because Black women have always been trailblazers who have for too long been allowed to make roads, populate the pews, tend to the fields and work the streets without ever being allowed to arrive at their own destinations, or to practice preaching and healing from the pulpit, or to enjoy the fruit of the crops they pick or the labor that they did for others. So what is Womanism? Womanism is a viable vehicle for re-envisioning what, how, and why we do what we do to not merely survive or even thrive, but to flourish. As a womanist Christian social ethicist who is ordained, claiming the space for womanist ethics within the Eurocentric, heteropatriarchal ethical discourse of the academy, or in the pimping proselytizing of the pulpit, our work is to call out the moral malpractice of the academy, the church, and the society. And this is more than just trending or mainstreaming. This is an insurgent movement. What we are trying to highlight is that the character of being womanish, of being grown, of being serious, of taking ourselves seriously, of not having the luxury of being frivolous ladies. It's giving ourselves the right, the authority, and the power to not only interrogate, but to subvert contemporary systems and discourses of domination in a post-everything era that has heightened everything that is problematic about eras before it. As a liberationist discourse, womanism has helped not only to identify and challenge the pervasive white and male biases deeply embedded in the fields of study, but also to transform and liberate traditional inquiry by raising flat-footed, candid questions between the locality of whiteness and maleness. Womanism at its best. And I know they say self-praise is no praise, but since all of us were at institutions before, womanism at its best, which I believe we do at Vanderbilt Divinity School, is intergenerational, interdisciplinary, and intersectional, and forever interrogates with the womanist meta ethic of never being satisfied with merely what is happening, but the how and why of it as well. We see these methodological underpinnings of womanist ethics, and we see its pragmatism and practice laid bare, not just in our foremothers, but in everyday brilliant sisters like Kimberly Smith, the sister who, in reflecting on her teen years with Push, laid out the specifics of the economic empire behind looting Black bodies and lying about Black lives as a maniacal genius called the American experiment behind enslavement, Jim and Jane Crow, and the racial profiling and unarmed killing that the same force used to plummet Rosewood and burn down Black Wall Street. And she does this all by the brilliant acumen, sharp analysis, and accessible language by using the flat foot analogy of playing Monopoly without following the rules. Bree Newsom does this as a modern day champion of unshouted courage when she mounts a different kind of pole and brings down a Confederate flag, which served as a clarion call and a skillful analogy, which has led to the taking down and throwing out of the vestiges and monuments looming large in our society that claims that this land, which is our land because we tilled it and we built it, is owned by pioneers who were little less than proselytizing, pirating pimps. When Michelle Alexander decides to couple her legal acumen with theological education, it is clear that the work of saving our country, making it great for the first time, is refusing to be trumped, but to know that this is the work of not just head, not just heart, but the work of hands as well. Because, as she says, our democracy hangs in the balance of our actions. And that's not an overstatement. As theological educators and womanists at Vanderbilt, I would say to all of you on the line tonight that it's our role to educate and to illuminate that equity and inclusion benefits all interests, not merely our interests. The revelatory value of perspectival discourse is believing that the voices of particular people and women, the most oppressed women in particular, have validity in themselves, as Ada Maria Sacidia says. It's not about the kingdom of God. It's about the kingdom of God. And the more we understand the particular, the more the universal can be known. Just as what I term radical subjectivity, or what Walker calls acting womanish, or your mama called acting too grown or fast, is a different way of understanding what our ancestors called conjure, or the millennials today call Black girl magic. So too, the more specific and particular the voices we present, the more they encompass the reality and the agency of all. That being said, who better can do the work of freedom work, liberationist work, liberationist discourse, salvific witness, to queer and queering the sacred and overturning what heteropatriarchal supremacy calls Black vices are in fact not just Black virtues, but they're the pathway to universal liberation. A womanist theology, as Jackie Grant says, is about lifting the floor. And when the floor is lifted, that's when you take the roof off the sucker and everybody experiences freedom. Womanists are not separatists. But when there is peril that plagues the moral muscle and the meaningful meaning of what it means to be healthy and whole, we have no problems cutting off atrophying appendages that threaten to take ours and our communities' lives. Thus, we have not only an interest in convergence, but we have a shared value praxis in minimizing and eliminating discrimination of all kinds, particularly the variety of discrimination that is predicated on the immutable characteristics and histories of subordination. In some ways, this is simple. White heteronormative patriarchy is ubiquitous, which requires our efforts to be equally ubiquitous. There is room under the umbrella for all of our efforts. We have to fight at every front. We have to be everywhere. We need to be in the courts, the classrooms, the congregations, the pulpits, and we have to be power brokers in the boardroom. If you are in the battle being fought on every front, you need to be at the front of everything. You have to centralize white supremacy and Black demonization, and we have to queer and query heteronormativity and expose economic and sexual exploitation. For far too long, history has been just that. Lies told in his story, trumped up propaganda that is nothing less than what Emilie Towns rightly calls the fantastic hegemonic imagination of pirates, pimps, and grabbers of our property. But the stories, our stories, are the future. And we're on the front line of protest. We're online on social media platforms. We're throwing lines to climb tall poles and bringing down democracy on the main. We're on the main line in prayer while we're in the line in the grocery stores and funeral processionals, because we are essential. And we know that we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. This is not the end times, but these times, they call for womanist work. And it's root work, because we have to get at the root of how we perceive and understand the world. And as we dare to bring everyone we can with us, and those who won't march to freedom, we will leave as dead and left behind. So we're glad tonight that we have you on the line and in tow with us. We can't hear you.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Lisa Thompson, the preacher amongst us.
Thank you. Gosh, in these moments, I am so grateful and reminded of the importance of this communal work and why we do this work in community. As I listen to my sister colleagues, building on the foundations of what has already been said, I want to say a bit more here about the particularities of faith practices on the ground in these times. So first of all, I tend to think most about the textures of essential work, if you will, of those who proclaim and hold open space for people to make sense of all that confronts us while we live in this world. I use the language of texture on purpose because there is a qualitative nature to faith practices that are saturated in their accountability to the present moment and traditions of faith. As we've made clear so far, that it's not just about kind of creating any type of meaning or waymaking. This is about folk trying to make sense of the world around them in ways that, trying to make sense of the world around them in conversations with faith and living in efficacious ways that spur our collective flourishing instead of our demise. Right? This is what we after. So the question becomes, what does that mean for the work of preaching, faith-filled utterances, rituals, prayers, and actions spurred by faith whether they take place in our sanctuaries, online platforms and virtual gathering spaces, or the actual streets and pulpits of protest and demonstration, right? And so I'll say this, any of these things that claim to be accountable to the times at hand, and faith makes use of the world around them and tradition in specific ways. More specifically, the way in which we engage the scripture, talk about faith, what we claim as significant, and whose lives we pay attention to and remain accountable to on the ground, all impact the messages and actions we generate in the name of faith. The best of preaching and worship practices are always contextual and nimble in their movement between the world around us, the worlds of scripture, and the tradition of faith. So then how are we accountable in the times at hand? Every moment in history, as Dean Towns laid out, is its own unique thing in terms of what we're confronted with in life. At the same time, we never escape human behavior being unpredictable, yet so predictable at the very same time. I always find myself saying something akin to, we're in a unique moment in time, and yet we're dealing with the same questions and the same problems taking on different shapes in an exponential way, as the powers literally battle out themselves on our bodies and in this creation. This unique yet not so unique conundrum is no less true as we find ourselves living through a pandemic alongside endemic injustices that are situated along racial, ethnic lines at minimum, and proliferated by matters of class, gender, sexuality, and abilities. In one sense, the pandemic created a reality in which people who might not have previously felt the pressures of constant vulnerability and impending death pressing in on their daily lives and bodies suddenly felt that reality, right? And here is where I turn to the fact that the most vulnerable in our midst have always felt these realities. So much so that the pandemic or no pandemic, we are in the streets protesting and demonstrating. If I'm gonna die, I'm gonna die in the street, right? For the sake of life. Therefore, when we want to consider what does preaching and worship practices, or what do preaching and worship practices look like that are contextual to these times, I say they do the same things they must do in any given time. Preaching and worship, no matter their form, must remain accountable to the most vulnerable lives in our community and in our world at all times. In these times, I find there is a spectrum of people trying to figure out what to do and say in the name of religion and faith, right? Those who have always proclaimed in a faith of both joy and sorrow, and with constant attention to the particularities of fragility, and those who have not. This is a new thing. And so here's where we get to the significance of accenting this conversation around the experiences of Black women and what it brings to the particular place of accountability in our practices of preaching and worship. The ability of Black women to not die is one thing, though survival is significant, a significant minimum to what we're after here. But the ability of Black women to thrive and to flourish by the words we say, the rituals we enact, and the public actions we take is a different type of litmus test to our sermons, the words we proclaim, and the things we do in the name of making meaning. So I've been playing with this idea of situated flourishing and life abundant. In times like these, we're reminded that faith is also situated and particular, and our practices are tested by their ability to spur us forward towards a more just creation, right? Alongside of those same particularities. Here is where Black women, the work that we do, even in thinking about preaching and worship, long test those traditions that we have called as Black prophetic traditions, Black faith traditions, and Black preaching traditions. Flourishing and hope and joy never escape the present reality, and they are always tied to our ability to push, to confess, and lament for the sake of better futures for us all. For us all, not just straight Black men who have long tried to hold a stake on this conversation and the practices themselves. So I think this is what we're after when we're talking about practices of preaching and worship that center womanist concerns in their midst.
Thank you. These are the women, the Black women on the Vanderbilt Divinity School faculty. These are the folks you get to study with if you come this way. These are the folks who are also making a way outside of the walls of the Divinity School and into various places in our city, our country, and the world. So for tonight, we have a few more minutes for you to get to ask us questions. What we tried to do with this first part is to look at the questions that were sent in as you registered and to get a sense of what could we say immediately and speaking to them. So that is what you heard us do for the first half hour or so. For this next half hour or so, it's your time to ask us more. We have one question that has come in thus far in the chat, so now's your time, load them up. I am particularly interested in humanism and the ethic of love as applied to both self-care and social transformation. Could each panelist elaborate on this from the vantage point of their scholarship and work? Panelists, would you like for me to repeat that? This is from Derek McCullers. I am particularly interested in humanism and the ethic of love as applied to both self-care and social transformation. Could each panelist elaborate on this from the vantage point of their scholarship and work?
Thank you, Derek, for a wonderful and insightful question. And I think what is beautiful about womanist work and even womanist theology is that it takes humanism seriously. Womanism as a pragmatic discourse in my mind, I call it pragmatic for the very reason because it literally believes that even in its theological formations, that there is no divine justice if it's not linked to social justice. That is to say, first natural and then spiritual. In my work, I have taken to looking at Alice Walker's 4-part definition. And when she says that a womanist loves food, loves roundness, loves the folk, loves the spirit, loves the moon, loves the struggle, loves herself regardless, I have termed that redemptive self-love. And redemptive self-love is the acknowledgement, not only to appreciate, but to unashamedly claim as a virtue the love of self and to stand up for self, not only with regards to agency, but in light of one's aesthetics, regardless of what anyone else thinks. Now, when Walker mentions all of what it means to be a womanist, she is literally taking bookmarks from the very things that the white heteronormative patriarchal gaze sees as stereotypes, problematic, and vices of Black folk: being larger than life, being loud, being religious, eating food, being fat with pretty hips and thighs, right? Being unapologetically spiritual, unashamedly Black. She's saying, no. There's a way in which whiteness has appropriated Blackness, right? There's nothing wrong with Black skin when it can be put on a white body. There's nothing wrong with hips when it can be seen on someone else's body other than Black. There's nothing wrong with what it means to be an evangelist or Christian in a very expressive way until it's on a Black body. So this notion of redemptive self-love is humanist. And it's saying that in the way in which it merges with the Christian discourse, through my own confession, is that, to use mother wit, God don't make no junk. That Black women are fearfully and wonderfully made. And in so being, that it is by seeing within our own gifts, talents, and aesthetic, the Imago Dei, that we actually can do divine work with our hands. So if you would look at Deeper Shades of Purple, that I edited, that Dean Towns, Katie Cannon, and others are in. If you look at Minding the Motherlode, this whole notion of redemptive self-love is there. And the work of Black male theologians like Anthony Penn have taken this up in their work, in his work on humanism and atheism, to even talk about this notion of complex subjectivity as a matter of what it means to have Black faith in our own agency. And I think that's where womanism dovetails very nicely to affirming that, because what we do with our agency, we can control, while we only can guess and wonder about what God is up to. So thank you for a great question.
You're muted.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
I think the one thing that I would add to that, and I think Lisa also spoke to this in her piece, that the ethic of love demands concrete action. And we can look at that concrete action, we can reflect on it, but if it doesn't involve being in spaces where love has been denied, then our ethic of love fails. I mean, look, we have all kinds of love songs. We like to talk about love. It's the doing of love where we struggle.
Thank you. Another question has come. What programs does Vanderbilt offer in regard to womanist theology? Dean Sheppard, could you take that one up?
Well, all the womanists you're looking at right now, we all teach courses in womanist theology, womanist thought, womanist literature, womanist psychology and religion, womanist approaches to religion. And all of those courses run across at least one, though generally one, two, at least two of the concentrations that we have. I would say at this juncture, womanist thought, womanist approaches is a thriving, sustaining, and growing red thread throughout the curriculum.
Thank you. Next one, I'm going to throw to Dr. Thompson. Greetings. This is from Michelle Watkins.
Mm-hmm.
Greetings. What does womanist work look like in the context of this pandemic and violences against Black life if we understand that first, the US is a sovereign state as opposed to a nation, and second, America to be a temporary moment? Unmute.
Dean Towns, is this, oh, I'm unmuted. Is this the question you're throwing to me?
Yeah.
Repeat the question, please.
All right.
Dr. Watkins.
If it is the Dr. Michelle Watkins, I think it is. Greetings. What does womanist work look like in the context of this pandemic and violences against Black life if we understand first that the US is a sovereign state as opposed to a nation, and second, America to be a temporary moment?
Mm.
I think you started working on that in your opening remarks.
Yeah. So I want to contextualize this in terms of maybe even thinking about disciplines, well, kind of practices of preaching and worship in particular. The fact that I think it looks like attending to futures just as much as the present reality. When I hear that question around temporary, sovereign state, temporary, we're also aware that we are attempting to create a world that is not yet, to create futures that we do not yet know. So as those practices of even preaching, worship, and rituals are on the ground, concrete for the here and now, but are generative as they are trying to conjure forth a world, a way of being that we don't yet know. And we don't have, but greatly desire and think that we need or know that we need.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I will take the next question.
Dean, there's a great one from Facebook Live, if I could jump in.
Okay. I'm looking for it. From Sakina, that one? No.
There's one that's not in the chat, if I can read it.
Yes.
Great. From alum Rebecca Wilcox. What does a womanist grassroots praxis of abolition look like? No reform, no police, abolish the military, and abolish Christendom, because these are the calls of the people on the ground.
Thank you, Rebecca. I see you have not changed in the year you have been away from us. It is good to know you are still fierce and asking hard questions that I don't even know how to answer half the time, but I will give it a try. One of the things that I think is so important that we not fall in the trap of accepting is that what we are seeking is unity and a sense of kumbaya without justice, without a sense of what is right and wrong. The minute folks started talking about something being post-truth or alternative facts, we turned the sin of lying into something that is vanilla and acceptable. So we can't look at those things that have been so dear to us as leading us to a sense of tomorrow. They have not been, and they will not. They're not designed to do that. They're designed to be tools of oppression and status quo, where some win and most lose, and many have no clue what's going on. So I don't know about abolishing much, because I think in some ways they're already abolishing themselves. They're crumbling. The actions I see on the street that have not died down. Just yesterday, some of our students were out at the state capitol getting beat up by the police. Interestingly enough, that wasn't covered by the press, but it happened. Folks are no longer willing to just take no for an answer. So much like figuring out what is it we want to be, how can we be who we think we need to be? Those are the questions that are more important to me, and not abolishing anything that I don't yet understand. What am I trying to work toward if those things are gone? And that's not what we have really talked about much. And even as we look to that which is not yet created, we have to look. And so many of us are not looking. So much of what Dr. Thompson and Dr. Floyd Thomas and Dr. Sheppard have said tonight is trying to get us on a track where we can be strategic in our anger, strategic in our movements to create a better world around us, and leaving our children something, as opposed to what we are now leaving them, which is a shame before all creation. And that's not the walk of the gospel, I think.
You're muted, Dean.
Another question coming from Singapore, from Lynette Lee. Who is watching from Singapore? I work for an ecumenical missionary organization that has been interrogating its colonial past on its legacy of the transatlantic slavery. I would like to ask what conversations of liberation you'd like to have with a global audience, especially in the global South, who have been impacted by colonialism, imperialism, white supremacy, and etc. I'll ask the others to jump in just after this. That is one of the key points of where we're going now as a seminary, is entering into a global conversation with specific direction at the global South, given that that is where the greatest growth of Christianity is right now in the world. And we're not there to be colonizers, we are there to be conversation partners and to learn. So that's where the school is going. Now, I open it up to my colleagues.
Our faculty at Vanderbilt have a very clear commitment to scholarly activism that is global, that is international. And we know that at the very root of academic discourse, right? If we think about the history of the academy, for instance, the history of the academy started with two fields of thought, two disciplines, math and religion. Because money matters, and getting a divine power to legitimate it is how we get away with highway robbery. No one knows that better than those of the global South. Our dean has been doing this work, I don't know, Dean Towns, how long, for at least 3 decades in Brazil. Womanist now, based on one of our past alums who you all will be, one of our present alums who you all will be in conversation with later, Melanie Jones, is leading this Africana Womanist dialogue that happens every other year. In fact, we were all supposed to be going there in August to South Africa to talk about this. Many of the rest of us have been working with the Discernment and Radical Engagement Initiative, with the Christian World Missions. And so we're all intentional about partnering with committed and creative thinkers and practitioners of our time, and looking at the way in which economic exploitation that has been seen as divine will deontology has infused itself within our communities and within our churches. And so what we've been doing at Vanderbilt, from Christian-Jewish dialogue, global relations, is actually interrogating ideologies of supremacy, no matter where they are. In not only colonized land or occupation, but also enslavement to imperial logic, right? So one of the things that this moment of pandemonium and pandemic is teaching us is that geographic boundaries do nothing to viruses. They do nothing in the way of hate. And so we are realizing, in King's words, that we are in fact caught up in this web of mutuality. And if COVID-19 hasn't taught us anything, it has taught us that. So this gives us an opportunity, and thank you so much, all the way from Singapore to talk about how then might we reset, reboot, and yes, even reconcile ourselves one to another, and realizing that the oppression that one of us might have faced at one moment, we all will eventually face. And this is work that we're committed to. And we're committed to doing it not just with creativity and disciplinary acumen, but also with compassion and care.
I'd like to switch gears a bit and turn to another question that's coming in through the Q&A and not the chat. This is from Erica Johnson. If the ability to thrive is the litmus test, in what ways is womanism accountable to its silence on the condition of Black trans women? How ought womanist theology, care, and work center on and show up for trans women?
You know, what I would say to that, I hear in there the critique about the lack of attention and lack of voices of trans women in womanist work, but I would not parenthetically say that it's totally absent. It certainly isn't absent in my work. Dean Townsend, in your work, but I hear that question much the way I'm sure early womanists heard voices like Renee Hill, earlier in my work, critique womanist thought and practices for two things. One, the absence of a robust voice from lesbian perspectives, and also the lack of voices of Black women who identified as womanists, who identified as either other religions or Christian and other religions. What I would say to that is that there's no perspective that is free of the need for its own self critique of itself, to look at itself and to listen to those voices, which, you know, it goes back to the question, what am I doing, why am I doing it, and where am I doing it? And that is, how far in from the margin am I? And when it comes to the experiences of trans women, most of us on this circle are in, which means we have to step out of the way, for one thing, and listen to not appropriate trans women's voices just so that we cover our bases, but so that the womanist work that we're creating is actually transformed by trans women voices, as well as, I would say, the voices of the actual voices of poor Black women. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I think it's important to note that much of the work of womanist discourse is literally talking about delving deeper shades of purple. And what does that mean? While I might be a part of the white heteropatriarchal academy as a Black woman and can talk about, oh, well, your lavender is met up against my purple. When I go across town to Temple Baptist Church in North Nashville, and I'm sitting next to women who have more month than they have money, my purple at Vanderbilt becomes lavender to theirs. So womanist discourse is always, it has to do the critical work of tending to the why crisis, to the so what, the relevance, right? Not comparing oppressions against oppressions, but in learning from the intersections of of others' oppressions, or of all oppressions, what your privileges are. So not for you to save other people or judge other people, but you might be able to save yourself from your own debilitating privilege. And so it is not this hierarchy of oppressions or comparing of oppressions, we have to realize that appropriation is always happening. But how does reciprocity and responsibility merge from that? And every time we claim to be purple, we have to realize that there's another oppression that makes our purple lighter. And that by seeking out that particular perspective, we might learn more about what liberation is. Because as a Christian, I truly believe that it's in the midst of crisis that we find Christ. And Christ is always somewhere where we never expect Christ to be, in the unlikely of bodies, in the most problematized of bodies. And so it is, you know, as we were talking growing up, every time you point a finger, how many are pointing back at you? So it always becomes the question of answering the question that our souls must have, because in the final analysis, that's the only agency we have, and that's the only salvation we can ensure. And it's only through seeing ourselves through the eyes of others who are more oppressed and who need us to join them in the fight for liberation that we might actually be liberated. And that is really what womanist discourse is about. That's why it's not just about the what or the who, but it's about how and why these things are happening, that we then can unpack and analyze not only systems of oppression, but practices of flourishing for how they might become not identities we can appropriate, but life lessons by which we might be able to draw down methods and practice them within our own living laboratories of faith or formation. And so that is something that is very different about womanist discourse. The way in which it is not positivist. It doesn't believe in objectivity, right? But it is inductive because it's coming from the ground. And you have to look at the people who are on the ground, the people who are on the front lines to figure out, how is it that you're surviving? How is it that you're thriving? What does flourishing and freedom look like for you? That's an intergenerational conversation. That's an interdisciplinary conversation. And it's an intentional conversation with people who do not look like us, people who do not live like us, and people who do not love like us.
Thank you. One last question as we draw to a close. What does womanism say to the performative acts of allyship and activism, like those of Nancy Pelosi and other congressional members wearing kente cloths, or corporations making commitments about inclusion and diversity? Y'all.
That's a Dr. Thompson question.
Listen, I will start here though. I don't know how much this, for those particular things, I'm not sure how much this responds to that. But in preaching, we often talk about authenticity and how authenticity is something that we can't always put our finger on what it is, but we know when it's not there, and the community discerns when it is and is not there. So as we think about these statements, those actions and the like, the reason they have been called out is because people are discerning some inauthentic behavior, something that is incongruent right there. And so it's just like the moment of preaching, just like the moments of proclamation, when you're saying there is something there that's not quite right. And so, I mean,
a dead cat on the line somewhere.
Right? There's something there. But there's something there. But it does go back to this thing where the community, you know, classes to a halt, the community actually gets to say what is and what is not.
Right.
And so this is one of the things where I want to say where we have to test that idea of allyship, the intentions of folk trying to do well and missing the mark, but also people being willing to be held accountable then. If you want to say you claim to be an ally, or if you want to be a partner in the work, then you have to also be willing to be called out for those actions.
I think it also speaks to something Dean Towns used to say, I remember you saying it a lot my first couple of years about have something in your back pocket. Well, one of the things we have in our back pocket is the capacity to discern the spirits, to discern the actions, to be able to tell what is authentic. And authentic means this: if you are willing to put aside all the privilege that comes with you being in a white body, when you can and where you can, give it up and be there, then okay, authentic. We have to ask those hard questions. For me personally, I don't want anybody saying they're my ally if they're not going to step where I'm stepping. That doesn't mean they don't have work to do, that's their work, but I'm not going to be I'm not going to change my steps to try to affirm their intention to be an ally. People are dying in the streets. We don't have time to help people feel good about some inauthentic moment.
And I mean, in womanist ethics, we call that, that fourth tenet of critical engagement. If I can't call you out, then you can't call me into community. So it is that notion of calling out and calling in, that you cannot have appropriation without reciprocity. So because Pelosi was willing to tear up Trump's speech, she can wear a little kente, right? But at the same time, like King realized, it's also part of a strategy. We cannot change people's minds or save people's souls, but we can respond to their actions. So when Starbucks got called out within 24 hours of trying to censor the individual expression of their employees to saying you cannot wear Black Lives Matter clothes. And I was the first one with tears posting, I'm done with you all, this, that. Within 24 hours, not only did they self-correct, but they printed out 25 to 50,000 Black Lives Matter t-shirts for their employees to wear. So their heart and their mind matters not. The issue is letting people know what you're willing to take and what you're willing not only to die for, but to live for, because our lives depend on it.
You're right, Stacey, but that doesn't mean we have to swallow the Kool-Aid and think.
Oh, no, absolutely not. You call it out, right? Because if you can't call it out, we cannot be in community.
Right.
And that is part of Black women's culture. If you cannot be corrected, right, you can't be in this house. Right? No. That is really that craving vulnerability. So it's not just about the combat stance of always fighting or the jungle posture, but it's also craving the vulnerability of people telling their truth and being held accountable. Because the fact of the matter is, which we all do in our pedagogical design, by the very fact that we live in America, we all suffer from miseducation. But once you learn better, there's an expectation that you will do better. And if you don't, you will be held accountable for what you should have known because we were present when you were taught it.
Good folk who have held in there and hung in there till the end. We have now reached it. I want to thank you for joining us tonight. As you can tell, there's always more to say. And that is one of the features I do believe that marks us as womanists. We know there's always more to say, and more importantly, more to do. Thank you all for joining us, and come our way. See what you might find out as you step a while on these halls known as Vanderbilt Divinity School. Take care of yourselves, stay as healthy as you can, use masks. I don't care if it doesn't make you look cute or manly. That's not what this is about. This is about our survival. Take care and good night.
Godspeed.
Night.